And we're off to the story now. The Development Action Group, in partnership with the Human Science Research Council and the National Association of Social Housing Organizations, has released a report that demystifies the complex legal and technical procedures involved in the disposal of municipal land. The report unpacks the steps, processes to be released by release municipal land for affordable housing across the country's cities. Development Action Group Director Helen Rourke now joins us to have this chat about this report. Helen, good morning. Thank you so much for making time for us. Just before we go into the findings of the report, just on the back of that report that we just played now by reporter Zola Sholan, what do you make of this particular element? That yes, there is the push for social development housing to be made available for people who certainly cannot afford. But what we find sometimes is that the infrastructure that is actually supposed to be supporting that development is lacking.
Yeah. Morning, Aldrin, and morning to all your viewers. I think, you've posed a really critical question here around how cities really use three things at their disposal to be able to drive social development. They've got land, infrastructure, and then, of course, planning. And so, obviously, we've been very focused on trying to understand, in particular, land, but that can't obviously be devoid of understanding how infrastructure plays a critical part in this.
Yeah, and tell us about what the report has found then in terms of the release of the land. And I see that when it comes to the Cape Town, the Western Cape report, or specifically the City of Cape Town's report, there's also a paragraph there that says that you can't really identify how many or how much land is owned by the city because there is, quote, fear of that land being invaded.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with, some of the very deep insights I think that we were able to glean while looking at the experiences of 4 cities. So that was Cape Town, eThekwini, Tshwane, and Joburg. And I think what was really interesting was that we were able to see that there were a number of things that were needing to happen in order to streamline the land release process. One, to be able to improve the viability and expedite affordable housing delivery. Also, in really needing to try and fast track this process, because as we know, the demand for affordable housing is really significant in South African cities. And then we wanted to try and see how procedures could be put in place to try and avoid the risk that projects get delayed. And then fourth of all was trying to say, how do we ensure that when land has been released, how do we ensure that that land is then developed? So we've got quite a number of insights that have been drawn from the report, which provide, I think, some really good examples or case studies around how cities have been doing this, largely learning through trial and error to be able to improve these processes.
Yep. Is it difficult, though, for municipalities to release the land that they own for social development housing?
So, just to say that it's a minefield of legal, financial, and administrative and political hurdles. So the risk is if you get it wrong or you take too long, there's a risk that the land never gets developed. So in this research, we identified 4 phases or 9 steps, and each one of these requires some degree of streamlining in order to make sure that land is in fact developed for housing.
Yep. Okay, so how do we understand affordable housing, including the inclusiveness of the type of communities that we're trying to build and a move away from apartheid spatial planning? But then on top of that, Helen, is also the element around if I do have social development housing being built close to a multi-million rand estate, the impact that has on my property value. And I've seen that, for instance, in Gauteng as well, how sometimes there is a pushback from the more affluent residents to say that, but this is going to reduce the property value of the asset that I own.
Yeah, so obviously social housing in particular has been designed as a housing instrument that's particularly targeted in neighborhoods that are largely out of reach for low-income and working-class families. What is important that social housing is, it's a rental program, and it's managed by a social housing institution that will, and alongside the housing program, also have a number of social development programs to support that. So families, typically to qualify for social housing, need to be working, And the income bands are quite wide. So from 1,750 all the way up to 22,000. Coming to your question around sort of NIMBYs, the idea of not in my backyard because they're concerned that it's actually going to cause a decline in property values, is largely unfounded to a large extent because social housing is so incredibly well managed. So what we've actually seen, interestingly enough, through our research, both in this research project but other projects as well, is that social housing projects in fact have huge potential to drive more inclusive neighborhood regeneration.
Yeah.
So, this dispels this myth to a large extent.
What about the conversation that's supposed to be happening between industry as well as the municipalities in this particular case? Because you find that industry is setting up, we speak about, for instance, the factories, and we know that most of the time where factories are being set up, not too far from that factory, you will find an informal settlement. So what is their what should their contribution be? This is now as industry, as the corporate sector, to say that how do we contribute to this particular gap?
No, and I think you're very right, because there's very strong arguments for why you're wanting employees to be contributing into housing. We've been having quite extensive discussions around how we think about employee-linked housing. So where employees actually have the potential to actually be able to come in and support perhaps even bulk rentals, so for their workers. We're seeing in some parts of Cape Town actually where we've seen developers in fact preempting inclusionary housing and in fact then providing employee-linked housing in their large new residential developments in the city centre. So that's a really good example of where I think we could see this moving.
Yeah, I want to go back to the report now, looking at social housing delivery since 2019 to 2022 per province. I see that Gauteng in total stands at around 4,595. Is this millions or is it thousands?
That's thousands.
That's thousands.
So
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, no, you can go ahead, Helen. Then I'll ask my question.
No, go. Sorry.
Okay. No, I wanted to ask, why is it that we see this disparity between the various provinces? For instance, if you have Gauteng at just over 4,000, yet you had other provinces 4,500. This is Gauteng. Then you have a province such as the Eastern Cape, for instance, at 800, and a province such as KwaZulu-Natal at 430. Why do we see this particular disparity?
So, I think there's a lot of reasons for why this happens. And we were very mindful of this when we were doing the research, that the delivery of social and affordable housing is impacted to one extent by finance and the ability to access finance. The other one is about the capacity within the sector. So do you have competent social housing institutions, ODAs, which is essentially the private sector, willing and able to step up and deliver? And then, of course, the third, and which is what was the focus of this work, was municipal land. And what we've, I think, been seeing is that obviously Joburg has a significant amount of capacity, both with SHIs, but also within the private sector, delivering into this this particular market.
Yeah.
And then, of course, how land has been disposed is a key issue of this, and how municipalities have been able to navigate this.
Yeah. Does it have anything to do with politics, though, and also ideology?
To some extent, but I think that what we've really seen, I think, across at least the 4 cities that we've looked at was a strong political will to release land. So, in Cape Town, you've got the mayoral municipal land release program. Joburg had something very similar in 2019. So I think cities are recognizing and realizing that their land is a really key asset in terms of being able to drive spatial transformation. It's one of the sort of significant tools that they have at hand. But how they're able to navigate the complexities of this process, develop more robust systems, both administratively and then being able to ensure compliance with the sort of legal mechanisms, the regulations, the bylaws, becomes really important. The other big factor is when you see land being released, and there are a number of instances where we have seen land released, but we haven't seen it developed. We were looking back to try and understand what was driving this. And one of the key findings from the work is that when projects are properly packaged and prepared in advance of the disposal, there's a much greater chance of things actually being developed. So what we call those projects are what we call shovel ready. And so that means that the cities are actually playing a key role in undertaking feasibility studies, doing the rezonings, and essentially getting those prepared for SHIs, ODAs to then essentially be able to hit the ground running.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Remember the report, the Presidential Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture. One of their recommendations there were in relation to people who want to donate land. Somebody who wants to donate land, and we know land, of course, means that the land is actually situated in some sort of a municipality. What would the role of the municipality be in such a case? If you have an individual who says, I want to donate land to the city better understands what this type of land can be used for?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think this sort of ties back quite well to the sort of earlier conversation we were having around preparing and packaging land, because the municipality can receive land, but they need to know what is the development potential on that site? Is it well located? Does it kind of match in terms of the environmental priorities? So you don't want land that's sitting in a wetland or sitting in a floodplain, but you also want to know that that land is strategically located. So in that instance, cities would typically receive that land, and if that land could be used for housing, you would ideally want to see it transferred onto the human settlements pipeline.
And just finally, tell us about some of the recommendations that you're making.
So, I mean, I think one of them, and we haven't spoken to this, is that, and we've seen this across all the cities, is really the need for innovation around community participation. And the need for cities, I think, to be investing quite a lot more in how they constructively engage with citizens, with developers, to ensure greater transparency and promote a much deeper understanding around the program. I think we know that land has a very material and symbolic value in South Africa. So it's really critical that we begin to engage communities to not only address their needs, but also respond to some of the fears. So I think that's been another one of the key recommendations. The second one was really around how do we streamline the processes around land release. And this really does mean that cities need to put in place a very explicit land policy for affordable housing, which means that municipalities can not only offer land, but they can also then package it in such a way that they can put in discounts and incentives to ensure that projects are feasible, and that over the long term that they're also able to protect these public assets. Yeah. And then of course the last one is really around how to ensure greater levels of compliance with the bylaws so that there can be greater trust between developers and public officials.